Welcome to USIP ISIP, a weekly podcast with Northern Lights Winery founder Doug Bell, exploring the experiences from leaders in business, social media, and family. Now here's this week's exceptional guest.
Welcome to USIP ISIP. My name's Doug Bell. I'm the host of the podcast, and I've got a very special guest today, somebody who is very well respected and is almost considered a godfather to the BC wine industry, John Schreiner. Thank you very much for joining me today, John. And I see you're drinking some delicious white wine. What do you have that you're drinking today?
I've got Character White 2021 from Hester Creek, which is a blend of I haven't even looked at what the blend, but it's one of their good, solid, good value, good quality whites that they've been doing for a number of years. They've got a Character White and a Character Red, and I don't know how many times I've recommended these wines. It's about $20 a bottle. It's great value.
Oh, it's incredible value. And of course, locally owned in Prince George, BC, although it is based out of Oliver, I believe, and a fantastic operation, delicious wines, highly recommended by myself anyways. Today, I'm drinking some of our Bell Family Reserve, which is a blend of blueberry and Haskap. So we have a little bit of the old world and a little bit of the new world here, I guess, today, John. And I'm really excited to be able to talk to you and hear about the development of the BC wine industry, which you experienced firsthand over many years. So why don't we just kind of jump into it? I know you're a Saskatchewan boy and you developed a real passion for writing at an early age, started maybe around the age of 25 or so. What kind of drew you to the writing industry, which of course you've now have over 20 books published within the wine industry and is very, very notable ones. Why don't you tell us some of your stories?
Well, I've wanted to write as soon as I could read. I think I still can remember the first books I got as a gift when I was a child, and that I would have been 8 or 9 when I got these 2 books one year at Christmas, and I remember them because I enjoyed them very much. There was a series of books called Uncle Wiggily. And I don't remember much more than that about them, but I know I finished reading them well before lunchtime. And I was annoyed that I didn't have anything else to play with that day. But I grew up on a farm, and we didn't have a lot of money. But my parents at least had bought me something that was absolutely appropriate for what I wanted to do. And I've been a reader ever since. I started writing. Heavens, I was already sort of writing bad poetry when I was a teenager in high school. I was on the high school yearbook committee for the full 4 years of high school, and wrote a column for the high school for the local newspaper. And I grew up in a town called Indian Head, which is about 40 miles east of Regina on the main line of the Canadian Pacific. And it was. I mean, writing was what I always wanted to do. Now, I think my father may have been a little bit disappointed. My father was a farmer by avocation. There was nothing that he ran away from school to farm. I would never have run away from school to farm. I had no interest in being a farmer. That wasn't my skill set. I enjoyed growing up on the farm, but my skill was I realized was writing. And, of course, I eventually discovered that I wasn't going to write the great Canadian novel, but novel writing, fiction is one skill set. Writing nonfiction is a different one. I'm pretty good at nonfiction. I'm not very good at fiction, and I don't lose any sleep about it. You play to your strengths.
Well, that's incredible. And in a way, you have wrote the great Canadian Bible in terms of wine, especially on the West Coast in BC, where you've lived for quite a few years now. So tell me a little bit about the early career that you had in the publication industry and in particular in newspapers, I believe.
Yes, well, after I graduated, in fact, I had a summer job in my last year at university with the Regina Leader Post, and then that led to to being hired full time, and I spent this was 1958, and I spent 3 years at the Leader Post. I was I didn't have, I mean, I didn't take a journalism degree. There wasn't, the only journalism school in Canada at that time was Western in Ontario, and I couldn't afford to go to Western. I went to the University of Saskatchewan and took English, which I thought was made a lot of sense for somebody who wanted to write. And then joining a newspaper was another step in learning how to write. And I mean, it was pretty basic. The cub reporters at a paper like the Regina Leader Post got these very simple things to do initially. I was sent every morning to go to the two local funeral homes and get the galley proofs of the obituaries that we were publishing the next day, and to see if I could get a little more information on these people, and then write a proper obituary in the newspaper. And I didn't do a very good job for a while, until the one day when the penny dropped. I was interviewing one of the relatives who told me how grandmother had come west in a Red River wagon. And so I started my obit with that line. And the city editor called me over and said, "This is great, John," and gave me a byline. And then the penny dropped that I had to have color in the lead. Uh, and, uh, and so it went. And from obits, you graduated into in those days going around every morning to the local hotels and the railway station and asking, "Is there anybody interesting in town?" I mean, that wouldn't fly these days with privacy, but in those days, people would tell you. I got my first airplane ride that way. There was a pilot from Texas who was doing the flying grids for Ducks Unlimited every spring, every summer. Yeah, in the spring. And he'd do a grid over the prairies. He'd count the ducks out of the window of the plane, and they'd extrapolate that, and that was how you established your limits in the fall. And so that was my first airplane ride. I quite enjoyed that, and it, eventually I got more experience under my belt, and I don't know, a couple of years into this, I found myself as one of their political reporters in the legislature. I mean, you got promoted pretty quickly in the Leader Post, because the turnover in a paper of that size was fairly significant, and we had uh, we had this endless parade of alcoholics who came through, and there were two or three of them were quite good writers when they were sober, and when they weren't sober, they got shuffled off, or they had to quit. It was a great experience in the legislative press gallery. I was in the press gallery when Tommy Douglas was still the premier of Saskatchewan. And Tommy was, I admired him then, and I still admire Tommy Douglas. He's still one of my favorite politicians. And it was a different time. Tommy used to line up with the rest of us in the legislative cafeteria, sometimes at lunch. And I can remember more than one occasion standing next door to him, chatting with him. He had the same thing he ordered every day. He had a stomach problem, so he would have stewed prunes and I think cream cheese. It was and toast. It was fairly bland, but and the politicians were accessible. The senior civil servants were accessible. It was a great place to learn to write about politics. And this was in the time when Saskatchewan, they'd already introduced the hospital care program in 1944, but in 19 in the early 60s, they were introducing full Medicare, and that was a very exciting period to be covering Saskatchewan politics. But I was also doing a lot of freelancing. One of my colleagues in the press gallery did a lot of freelancing for Time magazine and Toronto Star and the CBC and so on. And every once in a while he'd have something left over that he couldn't handle, and he'd give it to me. And I discovered that yeah, I could add to my salary, which wasn't all that great in those days. And one of the organizations I started writing for was the Financial Post, and their bureau chief in Western Canada at that time lived in Winnipeg, and she was in Regina one day and sat down, and interviewed me, and offered me a job. Well, a chance to go to Toronto, work on a major newspaper. So away I went in 1961. Started with the Financial Post. Again, knew nothing about business. Took me a while to get up to speed. Fortunately, the first beat assignment I got was the labor beat. Now, having come from Saskatchewan, I'd met a fair number of union people. I knew left-wing politics, labor, even though I didn't know much else about business, I knew about labor. So that allowed me to get my real feet on the ground. And I'm surprised that I ended up spending 40 years at the Financial Post and writing about everything under the sun. You can't imagine how many things I was interested in writing about.
Yeah, and so you're finding that your passion for writing is obviously very strong at this point, but arguably your passion for wine today is potentially even stronger than that, or at least the two are really synergistic in the way that you've advocated and carried out your life over the last many years. When did you first get your experience with wine, and was there a moment where you truly felt like it was something you wanted to be a part of your life in a meaningful way?
Well, I don't know why I was curious about wine initially, because we didn't drink wine at home except maybe poured at Christmas time, sort of thing. And my father didn't care for beer. He might have had a bottle of whiskey around for Christmas. I mean, drinking was not part of the culture that I grew up in. But I still remember the first bottle of wine that I discovered had a cork in it. I had my best friend in college happened to be living next door to me in Regina. He'd also graduated, and one Sunday, one weekend, I said I'll make dinner for us. He was going out to play baseball. He was going to come home for dinner. I made my pièce de résistance, which was spaghetti and meat sauce. And I'd bought a bottle of wine the day before in the liquor store, without giving it much thought. It happened to be a French Sauterne. And then what did I know about food and wine pairing? I got this home, and Sunday before dinner, I was getting ready to open the bottle of wine, and I got the capsule off, and lo and behold, there was a cork in there. Now, I didn't have a corkscrew. It never occurred to me that they close bottles with corks. So we went out on a Sunday afternoon in Regina. There's not very many places open. We finally found a corkscrew in a drugstore, took it back, and in the process of trying to get the cork out, I managed to shove it into the bottle. But we drank the wine anyway. And I know I started getting a little more curious. I would, now and again buy a bottle of wine. I didn't yet have a wife or even much of a serious girlfriend, so I don't recall that we did much drinking. When my wife and I moved to Toronto in 1961, we happened to be in a flat. We happened to rent a flat which is down the street from a Bright's wine store. Bright's was the big Canadian winery at the time. And I recall hanging around in that store, reading the labels and chatting with the guys and finding this whole subject absolutely fascinating. I didn't think the wines were all that great, but the subject interested me. And then I would go to the liquor store, and the Liquor Control Board of Ontario about that time had hired a few specialists on the floor, and you could go and you could talk to them about wine. And I would chat with these people and get a bit more education. And eventually I got to the point when I'd learned enough about wine that I would take every opportunity to write about it. I wrote about wine in the Financial Post. I wrote about the industry. It just, I mean, I don't know why it had such a grip on me, but I've always been fascinated with wine and fascinated with wine people. I've very rarely met anybody in the wine industry that I haven't liked. And there's only ever been one person in the British Columbia wine industry in all my years that I ended up not on speaking terms with. Just one. And
Well,
we
that's
won't get into
incredible.
that story. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
but
yeah. I want to know who that is, but maybe you'll tell me later. I
yes,
will say that
he's no
the
longer in the industry.
oh, fair enough. I will say it's very interesting that you say this because this is something we experienced as well. So when we were developing out the plans for Northern Lights Estate Winery in Prince George, my father was actually the Minister of Agriculture and Lands for British Columbia for a period of time. And the thing that he kept telling me every single time he'd come back from a meeting is that we've never seen an industry like this because the collaboration within the industry and the fact that the individuals who were successful in the industry were successful because they were supporting each other. And in many different businesses across the world, you are in competition with other businesses. And so, therefore, you don't want to give out your trade secrets. You don't communicate why something's working, what is working well. And that was completely the opposite in the wine world. That we found that people were open to all sorts of winemaking techniques, and the ability to get British Columbians to understand and get educated about the complexities of the BC wine industry really drove them to this collaboration method that you're talking about. And was there others or specific individuals in the industry that kind of mentored you early on as you were going towards this thirst for knowledge?
Yes, there certainly were. I mean, there were a couple of things that I did when we moved. I transferred myself to the Financial Post office in Vancouver in 1973. The previous guy here was moving down to open our bureau in Washington. It had been offered to me. I didn't want to go to Washington, but I'd had some experience in the Montreal bureau, so I knew I liked to be in the bureau. So we transferred ourselves out here in 1973, and I started joining every wine club I could find, and I also started making wine at home, and enjoyed it. And not all of it at first was very drinkable, but I enjoyed the thing. And then when I started visiting wineries, I think I started visiting wineries in 1975. I knew a little bit about the process, and so I would then pick the winemaker's brains or whoever I was meeting with to improve my ability as a winemaker, but I also was able to talk to them um, more or less on an equal footing because I understood what they were doing. Um, the the man that was really very helpful in my early years of visiting British Columbia winery was a guy named Evans Lougheed. Evans was the founder of Casabello Winery in Penticton. Casabello's no longer exists. It was eventually purchased after Evans died. It was purchased by Jackson Triggs and all amalgamated in Oliver, and the winery, and which was on the main street in Penticton. Was the tanks were moved, and the winery property became I think a shopping mall. But Evans was so generous with his time. You know, he talked to me to answer all my questions. We did any number of tastings. I had a somewhat similar experience at Kelowna as Kelowna Wines as well. Kelowna Wines by that time had been purchased. The Kaposis had sold it in 1971 to a Nabisco out of Montreal, and the Nabisco people sent in some new professionals, including a winemaker named Bob Claremont that I spent time with as well. and they had a good sales guy, and I would spend time with these people. So I would be picking their brains all the time. I would be writing about them, and of course I would be tasting what they were doing, and seeing the improvement. And this was a period. Um, Evans was Evans had recognized, or his winemaker, I think he had a Tom Honisch was the winemaker. I think an Austrian or a German guy, a bit of a curmudgeon, but a good winemaker. Had talked Evans, convinced Evans that you had to have vinifera grapes, not the hybrids that we had all over the place. And Evans started planting, or had his son-in-law plant a vineyard down near Oliver or Soyuz. I think it was Soyuz, which didn't fare well with the frost one year, but the instinct was there. They also started buying grapes in Washington State and making wine from those, and the wine was much better than the Marichal Foch that everybody was using, or the Deschonach, and so on. And then when Anthony von Mandel bought Mission Hill in 1981, he was doing the same sort of thing, bringing in these grapes from Washington State, while eventually, because there weren't enough vinifera grapes yet in the valley. But I spent time with him and with his winemakers. Um, it, it was there was only a half a dozen wineries. It was easy to cover the wine industry in those days. I mean, I yeah, there might have been before 1989 and the estate winery legislation. There probably would have been about six wineries. But the people were, I think they were as happy to have a wine writer around as I was to meet them. And of course, I got the industry started hosting competitions. There was one in Okanagan that was started, I think, by the late Harry McWaters. Initially, they called it Septober because it started in September and went into October. And that became the Okanagan Wine Festival, which is still going on. And I got invited because I was now visible, writing in a number of publications, not just the Financial Post. I was freelancing wine columns. I got invited to judge and did judge, I don't know how many of those competitions. The PNE for a number of years also had a wine competition here in Vancouver, and I got to judge there. So you got to see a wide variety of what people were doing. You came to understand who the leaders were. Um, the When was the great pullout? 1988, when 2/3 of the vines were pulled out because of free trade. The view of the free trade negotiators was they had to throw some things under the bus for the Americans, and the wine industry was pretty convenient, and the view was we're never going to make good wines in Canada, so uh, and uh, and now fortunately the 1,000 or so acres that remained under vine was mostly vinifera, and the people who were growing those grapes and had developed now by this time the farm gate wineries in 1989, 1990 were dedicated to what they were doing and were doing really good things. You had Grey Monk in that period had appeared, and the Geringer brothers. And in both of those cases, the winemakers had been trained in Germany. And the viticulture, uh, the people who started Grey Monk didn't have a lot of viticultural experience. They were both hairdressers. He was Austrian, she was German, but they worked hard, very hard at it, and they brought in some of the first Pinot Gris that was ever planted in the Okanagan, now the most widely planted grape, and they would win at the wine festival competitions. Um, Grey Monk and Geringer and Sumac Ridge, I think, for a number of years, took about 75% of the medals. Uh, and the people at Casabella did well, and so on. So you could begin to see it developed. And of course, I liked the wine. I would drink anything, not anything, but I was prepared to. Um, how can I put it? I had a feeling that these people were heading in the right direction, and I wanted to support them in my writing, which I did. I remember once saying in a speech to the industry group that I was a friend to British Columbia wines when you had no friends.
It's true, and you have been such an advocate within the industry for a long time. In the 80s and 90s, in particular, it was kind of the Wild West in terms of wine. So, obviously, vinifera, which is our traditional grape, the Pinot Gris, the Chardonnays, your Pinot Noirs, your Merlots, a lot of those grapes didn't exist or they only existed in a very small quantity. So, much of the quality of the product that was coming off the line wasn't very good, and or it just didn't have the ability to perform at the level that the newer varietals, or I shouldn't say newer varietals, of course, they're the old world varietals, were doing so. And there was something that changed between the 80s and 90s where all of these wineries started planting this successful vinifera grape, and it was taken a lot more seriously, not necessarily just as a hobby farm or something that hairdressers would open, but something that people wanted to develop both from a tourism standpoint and, of course, from a in potentially even an international sales and business standpoint. Can you tell us about that time and what it was like to be one of the first people involved in this process of transformation within the industry?
Well, I remember going out in the it would have been already in the 80s, but there were still vineyards, the old the old hybrid vineyards on Black Sage Road. There were basically two very large vineyards there before the 1988 pullout. I remember one day uh, going around one afternoon, hot summer afternoon, spending the whole afternoon with the one of the owners of one of these big vineyards, and and he was telling me all about grape growing, and I was really quite fascinated with the project, including with the fact that they had rattlesnakes in the vineyard, and when the vineyard workers found a rattlesnake, they would kill it and they would nail it onto a piece of plywood, and there was a big piece of plywood there full of dead rattlesnakes. Um, that doesn't happen anymore these days, by the way. There are still rattlesnakes, and they're now protected because the rattlesnakes were never particularly dangerous. I think there in the last 100 or so years, there's only been four people who have died from rattlesnake bites, and I think two of them were drunk. Um, so I can remember going out there and talking to this guy, and I of course uh, I was really I was so enthused about what he was telling me that by the end of the afternoon, he said to me, he said, John, he said, and I had told him that I was making wine at home. He said, John, he said, why don't you quit your job and come out to the Okanagan and I'll open a winery and you can make the wine. And I actually thought about it for a weekend until I realized that I didn't know enough about winemaking on that basis to make a success of his project. But I was that drawn into his enthusiasm, and of course those vineyards were virtually all those grapes were pulled out. But a few survived, and in '88, and then there was a fairly quiet period for 2 or 3 years. BC Wine Institute was formed, VQA came in, the industry was getting its feet on the ground again, and then all of a sudden the replanting started. You had Harry McWaters planted 100 acres on Black Sage Road of the Bordeaux Reds. Everybody thought he was crazy. Turns out it was a great success. That vineyard is now owned by Phantom Creek Winery, and they're making absolutely stunning wine. Um, Jim Wise of Burrowing Owl who'd been doing some real estate development in the interior in the Okanagan, building, I think, townhouses and so on. Excuse me. Decided it would be interesting to have a winery, and he looked at buying a winery at Peachland. And fortunately, he didn't, because that winery was that vineyard. It's always been a pretty poor vineyard, and but he carried on. And he looked around and he found this patch of land with no vines on it that was fairly inexpensive. I don't know what he would have paid for it, but it would have been compared to today's prices when you'd probably pay $300,000 an acre. I'd be surprised if he spent more than $3,000 an acre for the land he bought. Jim ended up buying, in cooperation with Kelowna Wines, up 350 acres, and part of that became Burrowing Owl. And I think Burrowing Owl's first vintage was 98, and part of it became the Sandhill Wines, which was the premium label that Kelowna wanted to do. See, Kelowna had an image problem back from the days when the Capozzi brothers owned it. Well, I mean, Kelowna is the oldest operating winery in the industry. It goes back to 1932, and their first wines were apple wines that re-fermented on the shelf and that sort of thing. That was the quality of winemaking in those days, of the understanding. And then after the war, or it was 1960, I think, that Cap Capozzi's three sons took over the business, and they started picking up their inspiration from what the Gallo brothers were doing. They would even copy the containers, and they were making fruit wines and so on, and they were hugely successful. And then when they sold it to Nabisco, and Nabisco started bringing out the what I used to call the faux labels, or they label put a French sounding or German sounding labels on it. Their most successful wine, it was the biggest selling white wine in Canada for a while, was Schloss Lauterheim. And these the wineries with those kind of the wines with those kind of labels were meant to keep the industry afloat, and did through the 80s. And then when the rug was pulled out from under them with a great pullout, then they had to come together with vinifera wines. And then you all of a sudden had Burrowing Owl opening, and Sandhill opening, and Tin Horn Creek, who also bought some property over on Sage Road, and then Von Mandel, Mission Hill, bought its first vineyard on Black Sage Road, and all of a sudden you started getting some good wines coming out. And then Jackson Triggs did a brilliant deal. Don Triggs did a brilliant deal with the Osoyoos Indian Band to lease land on their reserve, which meant that his land cost was even cheaper than if he'd gone out and bought the real estate, which you couldn't have bought reserve land anyway, and planted, I think, starting in 97, 98, planted about 800 acres of vinifera, all in the South Okanagan, for both for that winery, for Jackson Triggs, and also the joint venture that they did with the Osoyoos Indian Band, Incameep Cellars. And they had, by this time, they had good winemakers. I take my hat off to Don. He brought in the first Australian trained viticulturalist. Mark Sheridan is now president of Hester Creek. He was the first Australian trained viticulturist. There was only one other properly trained viticulturalist in the valley at that time. And I think the difference that we've seen in the quality of the wines since the late 90s and the early 2000s has been by the fact that there are now viticulturists working all over the place. The grape growing is so much better, so much better. and they really understand the terroir. They understand how to manage the vines and so on. It's not just a matter of growing the grape. There's so many tricky things to do. I mean, we got a great climate for wine growing, but you've got to know how to work with it.
Yeah. So you had a very interesting experience. I can only imagine how much your life would have turned out if you would have decided to go the route of becoming a winemaker full time. But you kept your job for a few more years. I believe you left in about 2001 and retired, so to speak. And I can't say that you're even fully retired right now. And turned your eye maybe to the growing wine industry and focused more of your attention there. Was there an event or something that happened which triggered this change in your life to turn your focus a little bit towards something you were so much in love with?
Well, I've always believed as a writer that the ultimate achievement was to write a book. Never mind now 20 or 21. In fact, there's a non-wine book. There's two. There's two non-wine books out there. I did a book in my early days at the Financial Post, a resource book for high schools on transportation. But that grew out of the fact that I was writing about transportation. And then in the late 80s, I was commissioned by BC Sugar to do the 100th anniversary history of the company, which was an absolutely fascinating bit of history. Very, I think it's one of the best books I've ever written. Because it was a commissioned book, it was briefly in the bookstores for 2 or 3 months, and then most of the books ended up that weren't sold ended up uh, in the BC Sugar Museum at the winery. And now, unfortunately, that museum is now the winery's on the waterfront here, and there's a big fence, security fence to protect the waterfront, and so you can't get to the museum, which is a pity. And when they changed owners, I've done that a couple of times. Nobody had seemed to have had the sense to move all. It's a great museum and a great archive, and that was what made the book easy to do. Nobody had the sense to move that whole thing to Vancouver Archives, where it would be available. I mean, tremendous amount of history. So but I started writing about my first wine book was 1984. I had um, I had been I had some time on my hands because I'd had something I'd been editing a supplement, and that supplement was a victim to a recession, and so all of a sudden I had time on my hands, and I thought, well, why don't I write a book about the Canadian wine industry? So I did The World of Canadian Wine in 1984. I traveled back and forth across the country. It was a much smaller industry than it is now, um, and there were some there were there were a couple of there were several really interesting and promising wineries, and there were some quite appalling ones. There was one in Montreal owned by Seagrams of all people, and Seagrams had wineries all over the world, so they had if they wanted to use it, the in-house knowledge, but they didn't use it on this winery. They made the wines with concentrates. They shipped the wines out for me to taste. I had 12 wines. I tasted them all and poured them all down the sink. They were some of the worst wines I've ever tasted from a Canadian winery. Uh,
John, just to stay there for a moment, how does that work in your world? I mean, you get shipped wines every day from wineries across Canada and most likely internationally, because you are acclaimed as understanding the consumer's palate and understanding what makes good wine. But you must have had a ton of wine that is not great quality. How do you balance the need to communicate positively about your industry with the need to be authentic and tell people when a product is not of a quality standard that you would support?
it used to be a challenge back in the early days of the BC wine industry. There was a winery that had a red wine out that I thought was carcinogenic. And there was somebody else who was doing a newsletter at the time described that wine as the worst wine that he'd ever tasted in his life, and he figured he tasted 7,000 wines in his life. Um, it was certainly one of the worst wines. I don't know. how I wrote about that. I wrote about that winery because the owner who's still with us, so I won't identify him, uh, was a great character, um, very enthusiastic what he was doing, and very good grape grower. He just was a rotten winemaker, and so what could I don't know how I dealt with it. I tended not to be. I tend to be very careful because I realized I could have um, probably killed a few wineries if I'd come down too hard on them. And I was more inclined um, to ignore it or to write around it. I think eventually the readers kind of figured out what John Schreiner was saying. I don't know if we were doing points in those days, in the early days, um, but I've leaned to being generous the whole time, and I haven't had somebody sent me some samples not too long ago and asked me how much I was going to charge to review them, and I I expressed considerable astonishment that he would think that he had to pay me. Well, apparently this does happen, but I've never charged anybody. I try to the free sample is, if I get a free sample, that's fine because I can't get out to the wineries all the time. And if they want a review and if they think that I can help them sell the wine, and if I think it's worth selling, uh, I will push back. I had a wine last year, I think it was, that from an otherwise um, competent winery that I thought just wasn't any good. And I told the agent, and he got me a second bottle, and the second bottle wasn't any good. And I said, no, I'm not reviewing it. And there's another way of getting around it. One year, uh, Cedar Creek released a wine that had been fermented in a big uh, pot, um, ceramic or not ceramic or whatever, a big jug. There was about 700 liter container, and this was the way that the Romans used to do it, and the yeti that would seem to be and there's still people doing it like that, and they did it 2 years in a row. The first year was a single varietal, and I didn't like it very much, but it was drinkable. And the second year was a red Meritage blend that had been fermented. All the grapes had been thrown into this thing, allowed to ferment with wine and yeast, and then eventually it was pressed off and eventually bottled. And I thought it tasted like mud. But and I thought, how am I going to review this? And then I noticed that there were 460 bottles had been made. All of it had sold at $60 a bottle. So I thought, okay, either John Schreiner, you don't know what you're talking about, or, and so my review said, I don't like this wine, and here's why I don't like it. But 460 bottles have been sold at $60 a bottle. I guess every wine has its champion.
That's a good way of putting it, and definitely is probably appreciated by the wineries. But I think the authenticity is important, right?
Yeah, no, the winemaker, when the next time I saw him, said, yeah, he said, John, that was a fair review. He didn't think much of the wine himself, but
Well, I think most winemakers are going to have a very good sense of their product, and if they don't, well, it's important that they're told that, because if not by you, the consumer will likely vote with their feet, and by lack of opening their wallet in the future as well. Now, when you started to go through the growth of the wine industry in the early 2000s and into the 2020s now where we are, a lot has changed both on the wine side as well as on the media landscape, where previously we really relied on a lot of traditional media sources. However, you've changed with the times and done a lot on the digital landscape as well. Of course, you have a very successful blog, thousands of blogs talking about wines across the world, and you use other types of media to connect with your audience. Was that purposeful, or how did that develop over the last several years?
The blog was purposeful. I had started out helping a friend who had a website, writing a food and wine kind of website, and I thought she needed some wine content, and I offered to write her some for free. Um, I mean, I'm a wine writer. Wine writing isn't for the most part isn't a way to earn a living, but I did need to earn a living from my wine writing, so I could write books, and I could write columns and get paid $25 a column or $50 a column or $100 a column. And because I'd had this great job with the Financial Post, and I'd retired fairly comfortably. And anyway, a friend of mine had this website, and I was sending her columns from time to time, and she sometimes was a bit slow in posting. I'd sent something a post that was newsworthy, and she would be slow putting it up. And after a while, I decided, well, I can do my own blog, and when I think it's newsy, I put it up. And so I think I started doing my own blog in 2008, and I think there's close to 1,500 blogs in the archive since that time. Um, I haven't done a I haven't done very much on either Facebook or Twitter. I don't know. I just there's lots of people that are. I'm following all sorts of people who are tweeting, but I've never been terribly interested in tweeting, and or mastering Facebook. Maybe I should, but again, because I did see it was going to that it had much financial impact for me. It would have had the impact of me getting the word out to a wider audience. But then other people I soon found were picking up my work and tweeting it or putting it on their blogs. So I was getting a lot of exposure, and um, the yeah, and I'm of a generation where I'm not as comfortable as some people are with social media. Um, I need to have my grandchildren around to help me with it. But but anyway, but it's I mean I'm not knocking social media. That's the way of the world. And I've seen the demise of print media. I've I've been I just completed doing my memoirs, not published yet, and I was going through clippings going back to 1971. I've kept a lot of clippings, and I've kept a diary going back to the 50s. But going through the clippings, I was amazed at the number of publications that I found to write for. I had a column in Vancouver Magazine for 10 years. I've had columns in the publications that have come and gone, and um, it I still have one print publication that I write for, West Coast Homes and Design, which circulates, I think, 4 or 6 times a year with the Vancouver Sun. And but aside from that, that's the only print that I do at the moment. I had also when I got writing about the wine books, that became a life. I think the world of Canadian wine actually, in a roundabout way, led to the commission to do the BC Sugar book. And then after I'd come out of doing the BC Sugar book, which by the way paid very well as a commission, that was also a very positive experience. Commission books are not usually that positive an experience, but the chairman of BC Sugar at the time was a very literate man, and he didn't want a boring book, and so all the warts are in there. And there's some surprising warts, but they're in there, and it's a real bit of history. So I went from that, and I don't know what it was that I thought to myself in '94, 10 years after the World of Canadian Wine, that maybe I should do another book, but this time just on the wineries of British Columbia. So I did the first Wineries of BC book, and then I had a lot of stuff left over, and so I put it into an A to Z kind of encyclopedia kind of book called a BC Wine BC Wine Companion, and then I did a book. This is all in the 90s. Then I did, and I thought, well, there's so many varieties out there that I would do a book on 40 varietals and describe the varietals, the history of the grape, and all that sort of thing. Who is producing them? What the wine says. Like, consumers now need that because all these wines are showing up. Well, I don't know why that book wasn't successful. I think it may have been because the title was Chardonnay and Friends, and it came out in '98 just as Chardonnay was falling out of fashion. I was actually doing a signing once, and a guy came up to me and looked at the book, and he said, "I don't drink Chardonnay," and walked away. And I before I could tell him, there are 39 other varieties described there. And that was now if I did that again, now there's about 100 varietals out being grown in British Columbia, if not 120. It would be a massive book, but I still think it probably wouldn't sell well. And then at the end of doing that, I was getting close to retirement, but I was enjoying writing books. Eric von Krosik, who was the winemaker at Summerhill, and is now the winemaker at Frind, and had been trained in Germany. Eric said to me, he said, "John, you should write a book about ice wine." And I said, "Eric, surely it's been done. I mean, there must be any number of German or British or whatnot doing a book of ice wine." Turns out it hadn't been done. No one had ever done a completely thorough history and account of ice wine before I did it, and no one's done one since. And then I thought, well, why wouldn't, when I was doing research in Germany and Austria and so on, why wasn't I running into the writers over there doing the similar book? And then I realized that ice wine was a big deal in Canada around about 2000. It was a thing that the Canadian wine industry was known for. It's no longer the case. I mean, we still make very good ice wine, but it's no longer the star. It's no longer the only thing we do. And I had, unfortunately, not a very good publisher, so the ice wine book didn't do nearly as well as it should have. It won international awards, but there we are. And about the time I retired, I did a little bit of business freelancing, and I thought, I think I've done business for 40 or 45 years. I want to do something else. And so I started doing more and more wine writing. And then there was a project that a publisher had started with another writer and a photographer. And the other writer was unable to deliver the copy. It was called BC Wine Country. And the photographer had taken some absolutely gorgeous photographs of our vineyards and wineries and so on. And I did the copy for it. That turned out to be the first edition of BC Wine Country sold something like 15,000 books, which is for a regional book, which is a lot of copies. And that relaunched me. And after that, I did, I think, 5 Okanagan wine tour guides, or 6. I did another edition of Wineries of British Columbia. I did a guide to the Vancouver Island and Fraser Valley wineries. I did a publisher in London asked me to do another Wines of Canada, which I did. And then I went out at a bit of a blaze of glory with a book called Icon about 5 years ago, which was all about the collectible, the premium collectible wines. There's about 100 wines in the book. And, I thought the BC wine industry, I couldn't have done anything like Icon in '94. The wines weren't good enough. But by 2017, we had wines that people were cellaring, and deservedly so. and that were being, sold at $50 to $100 a bottle and so on. And I thought that needed celebrating. So it's
Yeah. I
so
think
that
that's really what I like about what you've been able to do, and it speaks to your longevity, is your ability to engage people in the written form on a topic that they are already passionate about and they want to learn more. And so, what we have seen in the last few years is many of your disciples, so to speak, using the new media landscape to get their voice out and talk about the things that they love in the wine world. And so there has been this proliferation of the wine influencers, so to speak, and many, if not all, really look to you as a source of inspiration in terms of how you communicate what you like and what you don't like, and what the consumer should expect when they try that product. What do you think the future looks like for the wine world now that you've seen so much over the last 30 years and even longer? Where do you see the wine world going in the next 20 to 30 years, especially in British Columbia?
well, we've and by the way, going back to my wine books, one of the things that I think set my wine writing apart from a lot of others is that I went out and I interviewed these people, and I would ask some fairly intrusive questions, and I couldn't believe how often I was told the answer. Wanted to know where they were born, what their ages were, and all that sort of thing, because I was looking for the color. Okay, I could talk about somebody's Cabernet Sauvignon, but it was much more interesting if I put that wine in the context of that individual's career. He was a like think of some guy who was a Noble Ridge, the owner's there. He was a very senior lawyer, and I thought that was interesting to put that into the book too, as well as talking about the wine. Um, I think I think consumers enjoyed that and probably still do. Um, I I mean, the British Columbia wine industry, it should be in a good place. Um, they've got the VQA wines have 19% of the market in British Columbia. The other British Columbia, the non-VQA British Columbia wines, which might be fruit wines or might be the wines that are made with imported juice, have about 35% of the market. So, British Columbia has more than 50% of the market. So that's a good place to start at. Um, the average price of a VQA wine, though, is only $19 a bottle, um, which is a little on the low side, I think, given the costs that the industry is dealing with now over the last several years. So I think the quality is there. Nobody doubts that the consumer loyalty is there. The wineries are all running wine clubs very successfully. Um, the the challenge that they're dealing with now is the costs that they have to incur. The land costs are very high. Grape prices uh, are, uh, are quite high, and if you pay, I mean, there's a lot of grapes are selling for $2,000, $3,000 a ton. With supply chain issues, the price of shipping in bottles from China um, has probably doubled in the last year because of the shipping costs. I've forgotten which winery was telling me that they were paying the shipping charges were as much as the cost of the bottles. And so you've got that sort of thing. You've got the shortage of grapes, and we've had a couple of challenging vintages that the because of frost in winter or some other issue, the production has been not quite as big as it should be. There was probably the demand for the grapes was probably 120% of the harvest. Um, so they're the wineries are having to the ones that are not are not for sale are having to deal with those sort of issues. Um, the the land base, I don't know that there's a lot of more land that can be planted in grapes. You people with fruit wineries have got a little more upside, and I'm glad to see how successful the fruit wineries have been. Um, the I think in the Fraser Valley, for example, there's between Delta and Chilliwack, there are 50 wineries. Half of them are grape wineries, half of them are fruit wineries. Now, most of the consumers in Vancouver don't know there are 50 wineries out there because the industry is made a terrible job at promoting this, and that's a a bit puzzling too. Although in BC and on the island, there's and a lot more promotion being done by the producers, and I must say, I think Northern Lights is doing a great job at getting its message out. But for all, I see an email every 2 or 3 days, I think, from Northern Lights, but I don't see emails from some of the others. Um, the No, I think as I say, the industry is, but then, that's business. You always have costs to deal with in business. You've got to somehow get around it. You've got to get the prices up. There's been fairly significant effort by some of the producers to move the prices up. I saw a complaint about how fast the prices were going up on a tweet that Anthony Gismondi had circulated the other day. But you know, when grape prices have gone through the roof, land prices have gone through the roof, labor costs have gone up, the cost of bottles and one thing and the other. Um, and I think for the most part, the people will, the consumers are, the consumers are paying it. I thought, I would have, there was a time when I would have said to somebody that, well, if BC wine prices are too high, you can always buy wines from Argentina. Uh, I am astonished at how low a share of market Argentina wines have in this market. Argentina has some of the least expensive, good quality wines that you'll find anywhere. And I think it's either Argentina market share here is, I don't know, 2.5%, something like that. I'm sadly astounded. So obviously the BC consumer is happy to have BC wine. The Ontario consumer would love to have more BC wine if it could be shipped. Um, and I say the wine club way of marketing has been brilliantly successful. I assume you guys have a wine club.
Yes, yeah, it's an interesting industry because there is specific channels that have been successful and are growing over the years. You mentioned wine club, online retailers are growing substantially. A lot of wineries are selling more products direct to consumer than ever before. The other thing that's interesting is the wine landscape is changing as well. People want wine that is delicious, that they're drinking more rosés, more sparkling wines. They're drinking more fruit wines. They're drinking wines in can, in box, in bag, in bottle. And so there are so many innovative things that are happening within the industry that we're seeing. And also from our standpoint as the largest fruit winery in British Columbia, Northern Lights Winery really takes a leadership position in terms of building that industry that you mentioned is growing really rapidly in terms of the fruit wine industry. And a couple of components that are important for us are things like the quality assurance standards, making sure that people know what they're going to get, that it's consistent, that it's high quality, and that they, from one bottle to the next, that they're going to have a lot of consistency. And that's going to be really interesting because in a lot of ways, it's very much like what you experienced in the 80s and 90s in the grape wine industry. And if we're able to do that within our segment of the area, then there is a tremendous amount of upside in terms of the ability for us to grow all across the province, not just in the Lower Mainland or the Okanagan, but just like in Prince George as we are here in this area. So, John, I'm really appreciative of your time that you've spent with us today. Are there any last words that you feel are really important for our listeners that they might be interested in? And then also, I'm just curious to see what social channels or where people can reach out to you if they'd like to learn more about you or follow your blog.
I think the blog is basically it now. I have um, I'm not working on another book. It other than my memoir. Yeah, the blog. It's what is it? John Schreiner at blogspot.ca. But I think if you just Google my name, it comes up, and that's basically it. You eventually find my books. It's amazing. Even even if the tour guides are getting a bit long in the tooth, there's information there that you won't find anywhere else. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Your publications are incredible. I know I've very much enjoyed your writing, and you have contributed so much to this industry that, on behalf of the industry, I'd have to say thank you. And hopefully, we'll be able to see more than your memoir coming forward. I certainly follow your blog very religiously and appreciate everything that you've offered. John, thank you so much for your time today. And we're going to wrap up this USIP ISIP episode. I can't wait to talk to you again soon. And for everyone listening, we'll see you on the next show. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to USIP ISIP. Please hit the 5-star rating and leave us a review. If you'd like to learn more about Northern Lights Winery, text us at 604-670-4046 or visit us on social media at Northern Lights Winery.